So what happens when a regional conflict suddenly isn't regional anymore? Today, we're going to look at a hypothetical scenario from just a couple of years in the future, early 2026, to see exactly how one conflict could send this massive, devastating shockwave through the entire global economy. We'll trace it from the first shots fired to the ripple effects hitting literally every corner of the world. All right, let's just jump right in. We're starting with this quote for a reason. It sets the stage perfectly. We're not talking about just another blip in the market. The International Energy Agency called this scenario the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. I mean, let that sink in. The largest ever.
So to really get a grip on the chaos, you have to understand just how fast this all happened. I mean, we're talking about less than a week. On February 28th, the airstrikes began. Just 2 days later, you see the markets are already starting to freak out. And then, boom, by March 4th, Iran retaliates, and in one move, they sever a critical artery of the entire global economy.
And here's why that one move was just so devastating. 20%. That's the number to remember. This one little waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, carries a staggering 20% of the world's entire oil and liquefied natural gas supply. So shutting it down? Yeah, it's pretty much like finding the main water valve for the global economy and just cranking it shut.
Okay, so what's really fascinating is watching how the markets reacted in real time. Remember that date, March 2nd? The strait wasn't even closed yet, but just the rumors, just the news of the initial strikes, was enough to send the price of Brent crude jumping up to $82 a barrel. It was pure fear driving the train.
But then, the moment Iran made it official, the moment they announced the strait was closed, the price didn't just climb. No, it exploded. We're talking a surge past $120 a barrel practically overnight. That is the kind of price shock that sends violent tremors through every single part of the economy.
And you know what? It wasn't even close to being over. Analysts were looking at this and warning that if the blockade dragged on, we could easily see prices blow past $150 a barrel. And that number? Well, that number is a really big deal. Historically, that's the kind of price that can tip the whole world into a recession. All right, so where did this economic earthquake hit first and hardest? Well, you guessed it, right at ground zero, the Gulf itself. For the nations in the region, this wasn't just a supply chain disruption, this was the systemic collapse of their entire economic model.
And this chart, wow, it just lays bare the incredible vulnerability of the region. I mean, just think about these numbers for a second. 90% of their fresh water comes from desalination plants, which are now potential targets. 70% of their food, it arrives through the very same strait that's now blockaded. And their moneymaker, their energy exports, 100% of them are now stuck. It's a total, complete dependency on one single, incredibly fragile choke point.
So almost instantly, this economic crisis metastasized into a full-blown humanitarian disaster. You had food prices going through the roof as shelves went empty, the water supply for millions was suddenly under threat, those huge gleaming airports in Dubai and Qatar, paralyzed, over 4,000 flights a day, grounded. And then you had the expat exodus, hundreds of thousands of foreign workers who literally keep the place running, all heading for the exits.
And make no mistake, this wasn't just a temporary hiccup. As the Middle East Council on Global Affairs put it, the war had irreversibly shaken the region's whole image. People started calling it the end of the narrative. You know, that whole story that the Gulf was this perfectly safe, ultra-stable oasis for global business and talent, that story just shattered, revealing this deep fragility hiding just beneath that shiny facade. But of course, a shockwave this big doesn't just stop at the water's edge. It started traveling, and the first places to feel the tremors were, naturally, the closest continents, Europe and Asia. And for most regular people, this is where the crisis got real, right at the gas pump. Just look at these prices from Germany. We're talking about a jump of nearly 20% in a single month. This isn't some abstract economic number. This is the kind of hit to your wallet that you feel every single time you leave the house. For Europe, this was like a recurring nightmare. It plunged the continent into its second huge energy crisis in just a few years. And it was basically a perfect storm, right? First, a major source of non-Russian gas, Qatari LNG, just vanished. Second, their gas reserves were already dangerously low after a tough winter. The result? Prices for natural gas basically doubled, industries were threatened, and you had the European Central Bank starting to use the R word, recession. Meanwhile, over in Asia, the situation was arguably even worse. Why? Because they are the biggest customers of Gulf energy.
For them, their main supply lines were just cut, gone. So this wasn't just about paying more at the pump. This was about showing up to the pump and finding it empty. You saw widespread panic buying, massive lines for fuel, and countries like the Philippines and Vietnam having to declare a state of emergency.
And eventually, all these separate waves of crisis, in the Gulf, in Europe, in Asia, they all merged together, and they crested into one giant global tsunami that slammed into industries and economies in ways very few people had ever really imagined. This was the world's new reality, and it was a whole lot more expensive.
And here's where the story takes a really interesting turn, because it wasn't just about oil and gas, not by a long shot. The conflict also choked off the supply of all these other commodities that we don't think about every day but are absolutely vital. Suddenly, the world is facing a shortage of fertilizer for our food, helium for our computer chips, even aluminum for cars and cans. This one conflict was sparking a dozen other hidden crises, affecting everything from food to electronics.
Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about the US? They produce a lot of their own oil, right? Well, it doesn't matter. Oil is a global market, so when the world price goes up, everyone's price goes up. And sure enough, even in the US, average gas prices shot up from around $3.20 to over $4 a gallon in a month. Just more fuel, literally, for the fires of inflation.
And inevitably, this tidal wave of uncertainty and price shocks finally came crashing down on Wall Street and financial markets everywhere. You saw stock markets tumbling from New York to Tokyo. Bond markets sold off, and the big financial institutions, they started grimly recalculating the odds, raising the risk of a full-blown global recession to 30%. The future suddenly looked a lot darker.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? I think it's that our global economic system, this incredibly efficient, interconnected machine we've built, well, it might be a lot more fragile than we like to admit. It really drives home just how linked we all are. And it leaves us with a really important question, one worth thinking about. In a world this connected, is any crisis, anywhere, ever truly local?